The first thing he noticed wasn't the sight of the houses, but the smell. It was the scent of wood smoke, rich and earthy, a smell that meant hearths and warmth and life, something so profoundly out of place in the desolate wilderness that for a moment, 12-year-old Gideon Hartwell thought he had finally died. He stood at the mouth of a hidden valley, a place that shouldn't exist, nestled between three great hills like a secret held in the palm of God's hand. In his arms, his 5-year-old sister Mercy was a feather-light weight of unconsciousness, her breath a fragile whisper against his neck. He had carried her for 2 days, fueled by a terror so deep it had burned away all other feelings. Now, looking at the impossible scene of a thriving community, of tended gardens and grazing livestock, under a sky turning a soft bruised purple with twilight, a new feeling rose, a hope so terrifying and fragile it felt more painful than the despair it was replacing. His knees, raw and trembling from his long crawl and stumble, finally gave way, and he collapsed onto the soft grass at the edge of his salvation. This single moment, where the scent of life met a boy who had accepted death, was the pivot point for an entire history of survival and hidden grace. It was the culmination of a journey that stretched back not just 2 agonizing days, but decades, forged by the courage of others. If this story of profound struggle and unexpected sanctuary already resonates with you, please take a moment to let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. Your presence in our community is deeply appreciated, and by liking this story or subscribing to the channel, you help ensure these powerful narratives can continue to be told. I promise you, the path that led Gideon and Mercy to this impossible valley is a journey worth following to its very end, and its conclusion will change how you see the world. But this place, this Manna Valley, was not a random act of providence. It was the physical manifestation of a promise, a sanctuary built by the hands of those who had fought for their own freedom nearly 30 years before. To understand how a boy on the brink of starvation could be led by the flight of a single sparrow, and why he would trust a cryptic trail of stacked stones over the vast empty sky, we must go back. We must return to the events of 48 hours earlier, to the chilling, pre-dawn cold of a quiet Missouri farmstead, on the morning that Gideon and Mercy were stolen from their own lives and left for dead by the only person in the world who was supposed to protect them. Their story does not begin with hope, but in the heart of a calculated and devastating betrayal. Gideon Hartwell was a boy of 12, but the weight he carried in his soul was far older. For the 6 months since his father, Elias, had been killed in the fire that consumed his blacksmithing forge, their small farmstead in Greene County, Missouri, had ceased to be a home. It had become a place of chilling silences and long, cold shadows, a hollow shell where warmth and laughter once lived. Before, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, the taste of iron, and the rhythmic song of his father's hammer striking the anvil, a sound that had been the very heartbeat of Gideon's world. Now the only prevailing scent was one of dust and disuse, a sterile coldness that seeped through the floorboards and into his bones. He and his 5-year-old sister, Mercy, moved through the rooms like ghosts, learning to make themselves small and quiet, to take up as little space as possible in the life of the woman who now owned them. That woman was their stepmother, Lucille Combs. She had arrived from Springfield a year before their father's death, a whirlwind of public smiles and church-going piety that had completely charmed Elias. In private, however, her sweetness was a thin, brittle veneer over a core of cold, calculating avarice. Once Elias was gone, the mask fell away completely. Her voice, once syrupy and kind, became a flat, toneless instrument of command. Her eyes, which had once feigned affection, now looked upon Gideon and Mercy as if they were inconvenient pieces of furniture left behind by a previous tenant. She was the source of the house's cold, an oppressive presence that seemed to drain the very color from the walls and the light from the windows, leaving everything in a perpetual state of gray twilight. The only source of light left in Gideon's world was Mercy. At 5 years old, she was a small, fragile creature with their mother's wide, trusting eyes and a spirit that had not yet been entirely crushed by Lucille's reign. She was the reason Gideon endured. He was her protector, her storyteller, her only shield against the creeping despair. At night, long after Lucille had retired to their parents' former bedroom, he would whisper stories to Mercy on their thin straw pallets, tales of brave knights and hidden kingdoms, or retell memories of their father, painting him as a giant who could bend steel with his bare hands. These whispered moments were their secret rebellion, a tiny, flickering candle of love and memory they kept lit in the suffocating darkness of their new reality, a bond forged in shared loss and silent understanding. Their days were a grueling routine of servitude, Lucille, having promptly sold the forge and all of its tools for a sum she never disclosed, put Gideon to work on chores meant for a grown man. He split firewood until his hands were raw with splinters, hauled water from the well until his shoulders ached with a deep, burning pain, and tended to a garden that yielded little for their own table. He was no longer a son, but an unpaid farmhand, a silent engine to keep the property running while Lucille managed her affairs. The loss of the forge was a wound that would not heal. It had been the heart of the farm, the center of his father's identity, and its absence was a constant, gaping reminder of everything they had lost. The silence where the hammer once rang was louder and more painful than any sound. Hunger became their constant companion, a dull, persistent ache deep in their bellies. Lucille fed them just enough to keep them working, watery bowls of thin vegetable stew, a single heel of stale bread, and never any meat. Gideon learned to eat slowly, to make the meager portions last, often slipping half of his own share to Mercy when their stepmother wasn't looking. He could vividly remember the meals his father used to cook, great pots of venison chili and thick slabs of cornbread dripping with butter, the kitchen filled with steam and savory smells. Now the kitchen was a cold, sterile room where food was not a source of comfort or community, but a tool of control, a daily reminder of their dependency and worthlessness in the eyes of the woman who held their lives in her hands. This cruel existence was made possible by their complete isolation. Lucille had been methodical in cutting them off from the world. The few neighbors who had been close to Elias, who might have noticed the children's thinning frames and the haunted look in their eyes, were turned away at the door with polite but firm excuses. She would claim the children were ill, or that she was simply too overwhelmed with grief to receive visitors. Slowly the visits stopped altogether. The rutted track leading to their farm grew faint with disuse. Gideon understood they were living on an island, a remote prison disguised as a family home, and Lucille was their solitary, unassailable warden. There was no one to see, no one to tell, no one to ask for help. They were utterly and completely alone with her. Gideon's grief for his father had long since hardened into a quiet, stoic resolve. The tears he had shed in the first weeks after the fire had dried up, replaced by a constant, simmering anxiety that was focused entirely on his sister. He had learned to read Lucille's moods with the precision of a scholar, to anticipate her flashes of irritation, to know when to speak and when to disappear into the woodwork. He was old enough to understand the cold logic of their situation. He had overheard her talking to a visitor from the city once, a well-dressed merchant, her voice dripping with a sweetness he hadn't heard in months. He and Mercy were obstacles, the last two tethers binding her to a life she despised, the only thing standing between her and a new, wealthier future in St. Louis. Sometimes, to escape the suffocating present, Gideon would retreat into the sanctuary of his memories. He would close his eyes and conjure the image of his father at the forge, his face streaked with soot and sweat, illuminated by the fiery orange glow of the coals. He could almost feel the radiant heat on his skin and hear the powerful rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, a sound of creation and strength. He remembered his father's laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that could shake the whole workshop, and the secure weight of his heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder. These memories were both a comfort and a torture, a reminder of a life so full of love and security that it felt like a dream from which he had been brutally awakened. Lucille's cruelty was not always a matter of neglect. It was often a carefully wielded weapon. She never struck them, knowing that bruises could be seen and would raise questions. Instead, she used words to chip away at their spirit. She would constantly remind them of how much they cost, referring to them not by name but as the 2 extra mouths. She would compare Gideon unfavorably to his father, calling him weak and useless, and would criticize Mercy for being too quiet, all while maintaining the facade of a long-suffering widow to the outside world. This psychological warfare was relentless, designed to make them feel like burdens, to erode their sense of self-worth until they believed they deserved their miserable existence. Yet, Gideon's spirit was not entirely broken. It had simply been reforged, hammered into a singular purpose: Mercy's survival. Every small act was a form of resistance. When he found a patch of wild blackberries near the edge of the woods, he smuggled the sweet, dark fruit back for his sister, a burst of flavor in their bland world. He mended her worn-out dress with thread he had carefully scavenged, his clumsy stitches a testament to his devotion. He protected her from the worst of Lucille's coldness, absorbing the verbal blows and diverting her attention whenever he could. He was a shield, a wall, a silent guardian, and this profound responsibility was the only thing that gave his own life meaning. In the final days before their world was irrevocably shattered, a strange and unsettling calm fell over the house. Lucille's constant stream of criticisms and complaints lessened, replaced by a quiet, watchful detachment. She seemed to be looking through them, her mind already somewhere else. A new dress, one he had never seen before, lay carefully folded on her bed. Gideon felt a prickling unease, a deep, instinctual sense that the long, tense stalemate was about to end. The quiet was not peaceful. It was heavy and expectant, like the dead stillness in the air just before a tornado descends. The long season of quiet dread was drawing to a close, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that a storm was coming. On the last night of their old life, the spring air held a biting chill that even the thin wool blankets couldn't ward off. Lying on his pallet in the darkness, Gideon reached out and took Mercy's small hand in his. Her breathing was soft and even, a sound of innocence in a house that held none. He listened to the wind rattling the window panes and the distant call of a lone owl, and he made a silent vow. He promised his sister, he promised the memory of his mother, and he promised the spirit of his father that he would never let anything happen to her. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew he would face it. He would stand between Mercy and the world, no matter the cost. It was a promise made by a boy, but it held the unbreakable strength of a man. The storm broke not with thunder and lightning, but with a voice as cold and quiet as a winter morning. It was the 12th of April, 1889, and the sky was still a deep, star-flecked indigo when Lucille's hand clamped down on Gideon's shoulder, shaking him from a shallow, restless sleep. There was no gentleness in the touch, only a firm, insistent pressure. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of all its usual tones of irritation and complaint. It was a flat, emotionless command. She told him to wake his sister and get dressed in their warmest clothes, then meet her outside by the barn. Gideon's heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He didn't understand what was happening, but he recognized the sound of an ending in her voice, a finality that sent a wave of ice through his veins and made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. When he and a still drowsy Mercy stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the sight that greeted them confirmed his deepest fears. The old buckboard wagon, usually left to rot near the dilapidated fence, was hitched to their single, tired horse. Lucille stood beside it, holding the reins, already wearing her traveling coat and the new dress he had seen laid out on her bed. This was not a trip to the general store or a routine task. This was a departure. Everything about the scene was wrong. She never prepared the wagon herself, and she certainly never did so before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival. A small, neatly tied bundle was stowed behind the driver's seat, just large enough for one person. Gideon looked at the bundle, then at his sister's small, shivering form, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that it did not contain anything for them. Lucille ordered them onto the back of the wagon with a sharp, impatient jerk of her head. Gideon lifted Mercy onto the rough wooden planks before climbing up himself, his movements stiff with dread. He tried to ask where they were going, but the words caught in his throat. Her face was a mask, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, refusing to meet his. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft snort of the horse as she urged it forward. They did not turn onto the familiar dirt track that led towards the main road and the distant town. Instead, she guided the horse eastward, away from civilization, onto a barely there trail that snaked through the uncultivated backwoods of their property and into the vast, unclaimed wilderness beyond. Every turn of the wheels was a step further into isolation, a deliberate journey into nothingness. The first hour of the journey passed in a tense, suffocating silence. The rising sun cast long, distorted shadows across the landscape, but its light brought no comfort. The familiar trees and creeks of their own land gave way to an endless expanse of rolling hills and tall, unkempt grasses, a world without landmarks or signs of human life. Gideon's mind raced, trying to assemble the pieces, to construct a narrative that made sense, but every possibility was more terrifying than the last. He held Mercy close, wrapping his thin arms around her to shield her from the biting wind. Though he knew it was a futile gesture, he was trying to protect her from a danger he could not yet name, a formless horror that grew with every mile they traveled further from everything they had ever known. As the second hour bled into the third, the faint track they had been following disappeared completely. They were now moving through a vast open sea of prairie grass, the wagon wheels crushing a new path through the untouched wilderness. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a physical presence, pressing in on them from all sides. Gideon's initial confusion had curdled into a cold, hard knot of terror in his stomach. He understood now. They were not being taken to a new home, or to an orphanage, or to distant relatives he had never met. They were being taken away from everything, to a place where no one would think to look, a place where they could disappear without a trace. The methodical nature of the journey, the cold determination on Lucille's face, it all pointed to a conclusion so monstrous he could barely allow himself to form the thought. The wagon lurched to a sudden jarring halt in the middle of an immense empty field. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Lucille turned on the seat, her movements slow and deliberate, and looked at them. The emptiness in her eyes was the most terrifying thing Gideon had ever seen. It was not the face of a cruel stepmother. It was the face of a stranger, someone for whom he and his sister simply did not exist. There was no anger, no remorse, no flicker of humanity. She was looking at them as if they were objects to be disposed of, a final inconvenient task to be completed before she could move on with her own life. Her words, when they finally came, were delivered in that same flat, toneless voice, a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Walk in any direction," she said, her gaze sweeping over the empty horizon. "Perhaps you'll find someone who wants two useless mouths. I do not." The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a chilling calm, a declaration of their worthlessness, and a final, absolute severance of her responsibility. There was no room for argument, no space for pleading. It was an execution delivered not with a weapon, but with a quiet, simple pronouncement of abandonment in a place from which there was no escape. The full weight of her meaning crashed down on Gideon with the force of a physical blow. His mind struggled to process the calm, calculated cruelty of the act. She was not just leaving them, she was leaving them to die. She had driven them for hours into a desolate wasteland, miles from any road, any farm, any hope of rescue. She was consigning them to starvation, to exposure, to the predators that roamed these empty lands. It was a murder designed to look like a disappearance, a clean, quiet solution to the problem of two children who stood between her and a new life. He looked from her unfeeling face to the vast, indifferent sky and understood that she had sentenced them to a slow, silent death, confident that the wilderness itself would be her accomplice. Without another word and without a single backward glance, Lucille snapped the reins. The wagon creaked as it turned, the horse straining to pull it around in the tall grass. Gideon sat frozen, watching as the vehicle that represented his last link to the known world began to pull away. He watched it grow smaller and smaller, a dark shape receding into the endless green and brown of the prairie. Mercy, finally understanding, began to cry, a thin, desolate wail that was swallowed by the immense silence of the empty land. Gideon watched until Lucille was just a distant speck, and then until she was nothing at all, leaving them utterly and completely alone under the vast, empty sky. The threat was no longer a future possibility. It was their present reality. For a long time after the wagon was nothing more than a memory on the horizon, Gideon did not move. He remained on his knees in the tall grass, the silence pressing in on him so vast and absolute it felt like a physical weight. The world seemed to have stopped turning, holding its breath in the wake of such a monstrous act. It was Mercy's cry that finally broke the spell, a thin, desolate sound that cut through the stillness and pierced Gideon's heart. It was not a cry of anger or tantrum, but a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, the sound of a small child realizing she had been left utterly alone in the world. That single, heartbreaking wail shattered the paralysis that had gripped him, flooding his veins with a terror so fierce it burned away all shock and disbelief, leaving behind only a single, cold imperative. In that instant, a decision formed in his mind, not as a thought but as a primal, undeniable instinct. He could not stay here. This field, this exact spot where Lucille had severed them from their lives, was a grave. To remain was to accept the death sentence she had passed upon them. He looked at Mercy's tear-streaked face, her small body trembling with sobs, and a promise he had made in the dark of his room came rushing back, a vow to his father's memory that he would protect her. He slowly got to his feet, his gaze scanning the empty horizon. There were no landmarks, no roads, no signs of life. But in the east, the sun was climbing higher into the sky, a brilliant white-gold orb. It was the only thing in this desolate landscape that felt like a beginning, and so he decided. They would walk east. The first step was the hardest. He knelt again, this time to gather his sister into his arms. She was so light, a fragile bundle of bones and fear that clung to him with desperate strength. He maneuvered her onto his back, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck, her legs dangling at his sides. The weight was not great, but it was a profound and constant reminder of his responsibility. With Mercy secure, he stood up, his own legs unsteady beneath him. He took one last look at the patch of crushed grass where the wagon had stood, a silent farewell to the last moment of his old life. Then, turning his face toward the rising sun, he took a single, deliberate step and then another. He had no plan, no supplies, and no knowledge of where he was going, but he was moving, he was fighting back. His preparation was not a matter of gathering food or supplies, for there were none. It was a battle waged entirely within the confines of his own mind. As he began to walk, he consciously and deliberately built a wall around his own fear. He could not afford to think about the miles of empty land, the lack of water, or the predators that might lurk in the tall grass. He had to be strong for Mercy, and that meant locking his own terror away in a deep, dark place where it could not reach her. His entire plan, the full extent of his strategy for survival, was distilled into a single, repeating thought that he turned into a rhythm for his steps. Keep moving, keep Mercy safe, keep moving, keep Mercy safe. It was a simple, desperate mantra against the overwhelming emptiness of the world. The physical act of walking was grueling from the very first yard. The prairie grass was thick and tall, sometimes reaching his waist, and it snagged at his trousers with every step, making him feel as though the land itself were trying to hold him back. The ground beneath was uneven, hiding small dips and mounds that threatened to twist his ankle. He set a slow, plodding pace, one he hoped he could maintain for hours. The sun, which had been his beacon of hope, was now becoming a relentless adversary, its warmth turning to a harsh glare that beat down on the back of his neck. He focused on the horizon, on the shimmer of heat rising from the distant hills, and forced himself to put one foot in front of the other, his sister's life a precious cargo on his back. He knew that his own resolve would not be enough. He had to keep Mercy from succumbing to despair. After her initial storm of tears subsided into quiet, hitched sobs, he began to speak. His voice was hoarse at first, but it grew stronger as he started to tell her stories. He didn't talk about their father or the farm, memories that were now too painful to touch. Instead, he reached further back, to the tales their mother used to tell them, stories of clever foxes and brave little birds who outsmarted hungry wolves. He spoke of a magical river made of lemonade and mountains carved from gingerbread. He poured every ounce of his energy into creating a world of words for her to live in, a fragile sanctuary of imagination to shield her from the terrifying reality of their situation. As the morning wore on, the initial surge of adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. The sun climbed higher, and with it came a thirst so profound it felt like his throat was lined with sand. Mercy's weight once manageable, now seemed to press down on him with immense force, each step sending a jarring pain through his shoulders and spine. He scanned the landscape constantly, desperately searching for the dark line of trees that might signal a creek or the glint of sun on water, but he saw nothing. There was only the endless rolling sea of green and gold grass under a vast pale blue sky. The world was beautiful and immense, and its indifference to their plight was the cruelest thing of all. By midday, Gideon paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He gently lowered Mercy to the ground and turned to look back the way they had come. He had been walking for hours, yet the landscape behind him looked exactly the same as the one that lay before him. The spot where Lucille had abandoned them, the place that had felt like the center of his shattered world, was gone, swallowed by the prairie. There was no going back. There was nothing to go back to. He looked down at Mercy, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes, and his resolve hardened from a desperate hope into a sharp, defiant edge. Lucille had written an end to their story, but he would not let it be the last word. He would write a new one step at a time. He lifted his sister onto his back once more and continued his slow, determined march toward the east. The first day of their eastward march was a silent war waged against the sun. What had begun as a beacon of hope in the pre-dawn sky quickly became a relentless, white-hot adversary, beating down on Gideon's neck and shoulders with a physical weight. He walked with his head down, his eyes fixed on the uneven ground just ahead of his feet, trying to find a rhythm in the endless shuffle. Mercy, after her initial storm of tears had subsided, was a quiet, trusting weight on his back, her small head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. The tall prairie grass, dry and sharp, scratched at his exposed hands and ankles, each step a small, persistent act of abrasion. The world had been reduced to three simple sensations: the crushing weight of his sister, the burning heat of the sun, and the constant rhythmic pain in his own exhausted legs. His entire strategy was to outlast the landscape's brutal monotony. The rolling hills all looked the same, each one crested, revealing only another, identical hill beyond it. There were no trees to offer shade, no distant mountains to serve as a landmark, just an endless undulating sea of green and gold grass under a pale, unforgiving sky. The sheer emptiness of it all was a form of psychological warfare, a constant silent message that their efforts were futile, that they were a tiny, insignificant speck in a world that did not know or care that they existed. To combat this, Gideon focused his mind on the smallest of things: the way his worn leather shoes scuffed the dirt, the feeling of Mercy's soft breath against his neck, the pattern of clouds drifting slowly overhead. He had to anchor his mind to the present, because to think about the future was to invite a despair so vast it would swallow him whole. Whenever Mercy stirred or whimpered, Gideon would begin to speak, his voice a low, raspy murmur. He didn't tell her stories of their father, for that memory was a fresh, open wound. Instead, he reached back into the gentler past, to the tales their mother had told them when they were small. He spoke of clever rabbits who outsmarted hungry coyotes, of a secret kingdom of fireflies that lived in a hollow log, of a river that flowed with cool, sweet milk. He spun these simple fables from the thin air, his words a fragile shield against the terrifying reality of their situation. He was not just trying to comfort her, he was trying to build a world with his voice that was safer and kinder than the one they were walking through, a place for her mind to rest while his body did the grueling work of their survival. By midday, a new enemy joined the sun, a thirst so profound it felt like he had swallowed a handful of hot dust. His tongue was a thick, clumsy thing in his mouth, and every swallow was an act of raw, scraping pain. He began to see shimmering mirages on the horizon, phantom pools of water that would vanish as he drew closer, each disappearance a small, cruel theft of hope. He knew that Mercy must be suffering even more, but she made no complaint, her silence a more terrifying testament to her condition than any cry. The need for water became an obsession, a frantic, desperate prayer that consumed his every thought. He scanned the horizon relentlessly, searching for the dark green line of trees that might signal a creek, but the landscape offered nothing, its beauty a mockery of their desperate need. His exhaustion was a living thing, a predator that stalked him with every step. Late in the afternoon, his left foot caught on a hidden root, and he pitched forward with a strangled cry. He twisted his body as he fell, landing hard on his side and shoulder to cushion Mercy's fall, the impact jarring every bone in his body. For a moment, he lay there, the wind knocked out of him, his vision filled with black spots. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his ankle. He had managed to protect his sister, but the fall had cost him dearly. Pushing himself up was a monumental effort, his limbs trembling with a weakness that felt bone-deep. He knew he had to keep going, but the fall had stolen a crucial reserve of his already dwindling strength. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, the oppressive heat finally began to recede. It was the first moment of relief they had experienced in nearly 12 hours, a brief, blessed respite from the relentless solar assault, but the coming night brought its own brand of terror. The vast, open prairie, which had been a landscape of monotonous emptiness by day, transformed into a place of unseen threats and unsettling sounds as darkness fell. The wind, which had been a hot breath, now carried a distinct chill that cut through their thin clothes, a stark reminder of their utter lack of shelter. He found a slight depression in the ground, a shallow bowl in the earth that offered the barest protection from the wind, and there they would wait for the morning. The night was a long, cold vigil. Gideon did not dare to sleep. He sat with his back against the cool earth, holding Mercy tightly in his lap, her small body curled into his. He wrapped his own thin shirt around her as an extra layer, leaving his own torso exposed to the biting wind. The world was alive with the sounds of the night, the chirping of a million unseen crickets, the distant mournful howl of a lone coyote, and the constant whispering sigh of the wind through the tall grass. He listened to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the darkness, his body coiled with a tension that forbade rest. He was a sentinel, a lone guardian, standing watch over the most precious thing in his world, his fear a cold, hard knot in his stomach that would not dissolve. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, it brought no sense of renewal, only a grim confirmation that their ordeal was not over. The sunrise was not a symbol of hope. It was the return of their tormentor. Every muscle in Gideon's body screamed in protest as he forced himself to his feet, his sprained ankle sending a fresh wave of agony up his leg. He was stiff, cold, and hollowed out by hunger. He gently tried to rouse Mercy, but she was listless, her eyes barely opening. When he lifted her onto his back, her body felt different. Yesterday she had been a living weight. Today she was a dead one, a terrifyingly limp and unresponsive bundle that hung from his shoulders. The stories were gone. His only focus now was the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. The second day was not a journey. It was a death march. The sun climbed the sky with a familiar, brutal intensity, and Gideon's world shrank to a blurry, heat-shimmering tunnel. His thirst had moved beyond pain into a state of dizzying numbness. His thoughts became fragmented, disjointed. He would walk for what felt like hours, only to realize he had barely covered 100 yards. Mercy had not made a sound since he had lifted her that morning, and he had to stop every few minutes to press his ear to her back, desperate to feel the faint, fluttering rhythm of her breathing. The fear for her life was a physical agony, a sharp, twisting knife in his gut that was far worse than his own suffering. He was no longer walking toward a destination. He was simply walking away from death, one agonizing step at a time. He began to lose his sense of direction. The sun, once his reliable compass, was now a blinding glare directly overhead, offering no guidance. The landscape, with its endless, repeating pattern of hills, seemed to be actively mocking him, making him question if he was simply walking in a great pointless circle. The mental wall he had so carefully constructed to keep his own terror at bay began to crumble, and waves of panic washed over him. He thought of his father, of the smell of the forge, of the weight of his strong hand on his shoulder, and the memory was so painful, so filled with a sense of utter failure, that it almost brought him to his knees. He had made a promise to protect her, and he was failing. The thought was a poison, seeping into his resolve and weakening him from the inside out. His body was a machine that was running out of fuel, sputtering and seizing with every movement. His vision narrowed, the edges darkening as if he were looking through a long, dark pipe. The sounds of the world faded into a dull, distant roar. His legs felt like they were made of stone, each step requiring a monumental effort of will. He was no longer consciously walking. His body was simply repeating a motion it had learned, driven by a primal instinct that refused to surrender. He was aware of Mercy's weight, of the sun on his skin, and of the searing pain in his ankle. But it all felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. He was a ghost, haunting the empty prairie. His only purpose a single fading thought: keep her safe. The end came not with a decision, but with a simple final failure of mechanics. His left leg, the one with the injured ankle, buckled without warning. There was no stumble, no attempt to catch himself. His body simply gave out. He collapsed into the tall grass, the fall more of a slow, boneless crumpling than a crash. Mercy, limp and weightless, rolled gently from his back onto the soft earth beside him. For a long moment he lay there, face down in the dirt, the dry grass tickling his cheek. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had stopped. The insects were quiet. It was the sound of the world holding its breath. It was the sound of the end. With the last ounce of strength he possessed, Gideon pushed himself up onto his hands and knees and crawled the few feet to his sister's side. He reached out a trembling hand and brushed a strand of dusty hair from her forehead. Her skin was cool to the touch, her face pale and still, her lips tinged with a faint bluish color. Her chest was barely moving. He saw it all with a devastating final clarity. He had failed. He had walked them for 2 days into the heart of nowhere, and this was the result. He had led her here to die. The fight was over. He knelt beside her small, still form, the vast, empty sky pressing down on him, and for the first time since their journey began, he allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of his own despair. It was in that pit of absolute surrender, with his sister's life fading in his arms, that Gideon saw the sparrow. It was not a grand or miraculous sight, just a small brown bird, but its behavior was utterly wrong. Instead of flitting from branch to branch or pecking at the ground, it flew in tight, insistent circles above a thicket of overgrown shrubs a short distance away. It was not just flying, it was performing. Its chirp was not a random song, but a sharp, clear, repeating note that cut through the oppressive silence of the prairie. It was a sound that did not belong to nature's casual melody. It felt like a summons, a deliberate and urgent call meant only for him. For a moment he wondered if his mind had finally broken, if he was hallucinating a harbinger of death, but the bird's call was too real, too persistent to be a phantom of his starving brain. A final, inexplicable surge of energy, born not of hope, but of sheer, desperate curiosity, moved through Gideon's exhausted limbs. He had already accepted their end, so what was one last pointless effort? With a groan that was more animal than human, he pushed himself to a sitting position. He carefully gathered Mercy's limp form, her head lolling against his shoulder, and cradled her against his chest. Getting to his feet was an exercise in pure agony. His sprained ankle screamed, and his vision swam with black spots. He ignored it all. His eyes were fixed on the circling sparrow. He took a staggering step, then another, moving toward the thicket with the numb, mechanical obedience of a man walking in a dream, his only thought to answer the impossible call that had pierced his despair. When he finally stumbled through the thorny branches of the thicket, he found the first of them. There, at the base of a gnarled oak, were 2 flat grey stones, one stacked deliberately atop the other. It was a simple, unassuming sight, yet it was the most profound thing Gideon had ever seen. This was not a random formation, not a trick of the light or a product of nature. It was the work of a human hand. The precision of the balance, the clear intention behind the placement, was unmistakable. It was a sign, a marker, a silent, unambiguous message left in the heart of nowhere. It meant that someone at some point in time had stood in this exact spot. It meant they were not, and had never been completely alone in this vast, empty wilderness. He found the next marker 50 paces later, just as the first was about to disappear from view behind him. The trail was a barely perceptible indentation in the earth, a faint line of slightly more compressed grass that would have been invisible to anyone who was not desperately looking for it. He followed this ghost of a path. his eyes scanning the ground ahead for the next quiet confirmation. The trail led him away from the open, sun-baked prairie and into the cool, deep shadows of a dense wood, a place he would never have dared to enter on his own. With each stone he passed, a tiny, fragile seed of belief began to sprout in the barren soil of his soul. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was being guided, following a secret language written in stone. The path grew steeper, winding its way down into a deep, narrow ravine. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under his worn shoes, and he had to brace himself against tree trunks to keep from falling, all while shielding Mercy's still form with his own body. The air grew cooler here, thick with the damp, earthy smell of moss and decaying leaves. The sun disappeared behind the high walls of the ravine, plunging them into a premature twilight. Several times he thought the trail had ended, that his brief flicker of hope was just another cruel mirage. But each time, just as despair began to reclaim him, another stack of stones would appear from behind a curtain of ferns or around a bend in the narrow passage, a silent, steady reassurance to keep moving forward. After what felt like an eternity in the belly of the earth, the ravine began to widen, and a new quality of light appeared ahead. He stumbled forward, pushing past a final screen of low-hanging willow branches, and stepped out of the darkness. The world that opened up before him was so unexpected, so impossible, that for a long moment all he could do was stand and stare, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He was standing at the mouth of a hidden valley, a perfect bowl of green land, nestled between three great forested hills like a secret held in the cupped palm of God's hand. The sun had just begun to set, and the sky above the valley was a soft, bruised purple, streaked with the last embers of daylight. The first thing he noticed wasn't the sight of the houses, but the smell. It was the scent of wood smoke, rich and earthy, a smell that meant hearths and warmth and life. It was the smell of cooking food and communal fires, an aroma so profoundly out of place in the desolate wilderness that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. For 2 days, the world had smelled of nothing but dry grass, dust, and his own sweat-soaked fear. This scent was the absolute antithesis of that existence. It was the smell of home, of safety, of civilization, a scent so deeply comforting and so wildly improbable that Gideon's exhausted mind offered only one logical explanation. He had finally died, and this was the heaven his mother had always described to him. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw that it was real. Scattered across the valley floor were more than a dozen small but sturdy wooden houses, each with a plume of white smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. He saw tended gardens, rows of green shoots pushing up from the dark earth, and a small herd of livestock grazing peacefully in a fenced pasture. It was a living, breathing community, a pocket of impossible life hidden from the rest of the world. This was not a mirage or an afterlife. It was a sanctuary, a place of impossible safety that he had been led to by a sparrow and a line of stones. The sheer, unadulterated reality of it was more overwhelming than any hallucination could ever have been. A new feeling rose up inside him, something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. It was hope, but this was not the gentle, comforting hope of a prayer answered. It was a hope so terrifying and fragile that it felt more painful than the despair it was replacing. It was a hope that meant Mercy might actually live. It was a hope that meant their suffering might be over. It was a hope that was so immense, so overwhelming, that it threatened to shatter the last of his carefully constructed composure. His body, which had been running on a fuel of pure, defiant will for 2 days, recognized that its job was finally done. His knees, raw and trembling from his long, agonizing journey, finally gave way. He did not fall so much as crumple, collapsing onto the soft, cool grass at the very edge of his salvation. Mercy remained a feather-light weight in his arms, her breath a fragile whisper against his neck. But for the first time, he believed it was a breath that would continue. He lay there, the impossible scent of wood smoke filling his lungs, the sight of a real home filling his vision, and the profound, earth-shattering relief was so total that it felt like its own kind of death, a final, complete surrender not to despair, but to the unbelievable promise of life. The full weight of the valley's history fell upon Gideon not in a single crushing blow, but in the slow, measured cadence of a 70-year-old woman's voice. Mama Ruth Washington, the community's matriarch, sat with him by the warmth of her hearth, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees. Mercy was asleep in another room, her breathing deep and even for the first time in months, her belly full of warm stew and cornbread. Gideon, wrapped in a clean wool blanket, listened as Mama Ruth spoke, her words weaving a story that stretched back decades, a tapestry of pain and resilience that suddenly and irrevocably became a part of his own. She explained that Manor Valley was not an accident of geography, but a deliberate creation, a sanctuary carved from the wilderness in 1864 by a group of fugitive slaves who had found this hidden place and vowed never to leave it. She spoke of the world outside the valley, a world that had hunted them like animals, a world that saw their very existence as an affront. She described the fear and the courage that had fueled their flight, the desperate search for a place where they could breathe free, a place where their children could be born without the brand of ownership. Gideon listened, and the cold, abstract facts of history he had read in school books became real and immediate. He was sitting in a room built by the hands of people who had endured a cruelty far greater than his own, people who had faced an entire system of oppression, not just a single greedy woman. His own ordeal, which had felt like the singular defining tragedy of the universe, was suddenly placed into a much larger, older story of human suffering and the relentless, defiant will to survive. The true revelation, the one that cracked open the foundations of Gideon's understanding, came when Mama Ruth spoke of the path. The trail of stacked stones was not a random guide left by a lone traveler. It was a remnant, she explained, a sacred and almost forgotten spur of the Underground Railroad. It was a secret road, built with silent prayers and desperate hands, a lifeline for those fleeing bondage. The sparrow he had seen was no miracle. The birds had learned over generations that people sometimes followed the path, and a dropped seed or a crumb of bread was a frequent reward. The path was not magic, but it was something far more powerful. It was the physical manifestation of human compassion, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, people risked everything to help one another toward the light. Gideon's mind reeled with the impossible weight of this truth. The stones he had followed, the path that had felt like a lifeline thrown to him by God himself, had been laid 30 years before he was even born. It had been built by men and women whose names he would never know, people who were fighting for their own lives, and yet had the foresight and the grace to leave a trail for others who might follow. He understood then that he had not been wandering alone in a hostile wilderness. He had been walking on a road paved with courage, guided by a legacy of hope. The people who built that path had not known him, could not have imagined a small, white boy and his sister would one day need it, but their act of love had transcended time and race and circumstance to save him all the same. Mama Ruth then looked at him, her eyes old and filled with a deep, quiet wisdom, and she told him the valley's most sacred belief. The path, she said, was not always visible. It only revealed itself to those in the deepest, most absolute need, to those who had been pushed to the very edge of their own endurance. For years it had remained hidden, a memory kept alive in their stories. His arrival, carrying a starving child, was not seen as an intrusion. It was seen as a sign, a confirmation that the spirit of the founders, the spirit of sanctuary and survival that had given birth to this place, was still alive and at work in the world. He was not an outsider who had stumbled upon their secret. He was a pilgrim who had been led to their door by the same desperate hope that had guided their own ancestors. In that moment, everything shifted. The world was no longer a place of random cruelty and indifferent emptiness. It was a place where acts of goodness echoed through time, where the courage of one generation could become the salvation of another. Lucille's betrayal, which had felt like the final word on the nature of humanity, was suddenly reduced to what it was, a small, selfish act of darkness in a world that also contained an immense and powerful light. The love of strangers, of people long dead, had reached across the decades to pull him from the brink. He had been forgotten by the one person who was supposed to care for him, but he had been saved by the memory of a whole community of people who had fought for the very idea of a better life. He thought of his father, of the strength in his hands and the warmth of his laugh, And for the first time, the memory did not bring a fresh wave of pain. Instead, it brought a profound sense of connection. His father had been a good man, a man who believed in helping his neighbors, in the quiet strength of community. Gideon realized that the people of this valley, the people who had built this path, were his father's people, not in blood, but in spirit. They were the ones who built things, who protected the vulnerable, who stood against the darkness. He had not lost his family. He had found a new branch of it, one whose roots ran deeper than he could have ever imagined, back into the very soil of human decency. That night, as he lay on a soft pallet near the fire, listening to the gentle sound of Mercy's sleeping breath, the dam inside him finally broke. The grief for his father, the terror of their abandonment, the agony of their journey, and the overwhelming, crushing relief of their rescue all came pouring out. He pulled the blanket over his head, muffling the sound of his own sobs, and he wept. He wept for the father he had lost and the mother he barely remembered. He wept for the cruelty of his stepmother and for the innocence his sister had lost. But most of all, he wept with a gratitude so immense and so profound that it felt like it could split his heart in two. He wept for the anonymous, heroic love of the people who had built a road to save a boy they would never meet. He wept because he was home. For 3 years, Manor Valley was more than a refuge. It was a home. Gideon and Mercy were not guests or charity cases. They were family, woven into the fabric of the community's life. He learned to farm the rich valley soil, to hunt in the surrounding hills, and to read from books Mama Ruth had carefully preserved. Mercy, her spirit uncrushed, blossomed in the warmth and safety of the valley, her laughter echoing among the tall trees. The scars of their ordeal remained, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of a past that had been overcome, testaments to the resilience of the human heart when nurtured by kindness. They were no longer the abandoned children of Elias Hartwell. They were Gideon and Mercy of Manor Valley, children of a whole community. The past returned not as a threat but as an opportunity, carried by a friendly teamster named Solomon Tate, who sometimes traded with the valley. On a trip to Springfield, he recognized Gideon from an old missing persons notice, and the story of their survival unraveled. An investigation into Lucille Combs, long dormant, was reopened with a vengeance. It was discovered that the fire at the forge had not been an accident, and that Elias Hartwell had been slowly poisoned for months. Lucille's avarice had not stopped at abandonment. It had begun with murder. Justice, when it came, was swift and absolute. She was tried, convicted, and hanged for her crimes, her name becoming a dark footnote in the story of their lives. With Lucille's conviction came the restoration of the Hartwell inheritance. The farm, the land, and the money she had stolen were returned in full to Gideon, who was now 15 years old, and legally his father's sole heir. The world outside the valley offered him a return to his old life, a chance to reclaim his name and his property. But Gideon knew that his old life was gone, and that his true inheritance was not a plot of land in Greene County, but the community that had saved him. He made a decision that baffled the lawyers in Springfield, but was perfectly understood by the people of Manor Valley. He took every last dollar of his inheritance and used it to legally purchase the thousands of acres of wilderness that encompassed the valley and the surrounding hills. He placed the deed in a trust, managed by a board of the valley's elders, ensuring that the land would belong to the community in perpetuity. It could never be sold, never be divided, never be taken away. The descendants of the fugitive slaves who had founded this place as a hidden sanctuary were now and forever would be its legal and rightful owners. It was more than a financial transaction. It was the completion of a circle. The courage of their ancestors had saved his life, and now the legacy of his father would be used to secure their future. He was repaying a debt to people who had never asked for payment, ensuring that the light they had lit in the wilderness would never be extinguished. Gideon never left. He was formally adopted by Mama Ruth Washington, taking her name as his own. The boy who had been cast out as a useless mouth found his purpose not in reclaiming what was his, but in protecting what he had found. Years later, he married Mama Ruth's granddaughter, Hope, and their children grew up knowing the story of the stone path, a sacred history of their family. Mercy, raised in the embrace of the valley's strength and wisdom, carried its spirit out into the world. She went on to study medicine, becoming one of Missouri's first accredited female doctors, her life's work dedicated to healing the vulnerable, a living testament to the community that had saved her when the world had thrown her away.